Alrighty. Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location, and I'm your host for this evening. I'm so excited to be introducing Melissa Blair, Marie Lou, and Zoraida Cordova here to discuss Melissa's debut novel, A Broken Blade, which just came out on Tuesday. So, join me in wishing her a huge, huge happy book birthday. But before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. For those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We're having more and more of our events in person, which is so exciting, but our online program is sticking around to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and of course for buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So if you haven't gotten your hands on any of the books that come up this evening and you'd like to, I will be linking books in chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in, grab a copy off the shelf, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local or not leaving the house, we of course ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat over to our website. And while you're on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up this summer and fall. So if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's just a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, you can follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. And we even have a TikTok. So if that's your thing, go check it out. There might be something over there for you. So tonight we are here for about an hour, and towards the end we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should either be at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and for connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in the chat. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I do want to remind you to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, which can happen in the world of Zoom, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them. And we so appreciate your patience and understanding. Alrighty, so now it's time for us all to settle in, because without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Melissa Blair, whose debut novel, The Broken Blade, is what brings us all together this evening. She has a graduate degree in applied linguistics and discourse studies, and is a book talk star who discusses her favorite books, especially Indigenous and queer fiction, fantasy literature, and nonfiction. And I will link that account in chat because it is so good. In conversation this evening, I'm so pleased to welcome 2 wonderful authors. First, Marie Lou, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of a number of legendary YA series, including the Legend series, the Young Elites trilogy, the Warcross series, the Sky Hunter series, Batman, Nightwalker, and the Kingdom of Back. And if one very cool job wasn't enough, she also worked in the video game industry, where she's an artist. And for our next author, the amazing Zoraida Cordova, the acclaimed author of more than a dozen novels and short stories, including the Brooklyn Bruja series, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, A Crash of Fate, and the Inheritance of Arcadia, Divina. She also writes romance novels as Zoe Castile, but not only is she 2 authors, she also serves on the board of We Need Diverse Books and is the co-editor of the best-selling anthologies Vampires Never Get Old, as well as the co-host of the writing podcast Deadline City. So the book this evening is, of course, The Broken Blade, which draws from Melissa's own experiences as an Anishinaabe to tell a gripping, action-packed story of anti-colonialism, rebellion, and so much heart. Chloe Gong called it much-needed fantasy with its fangs honed sharp by the power of resistance. So thank you all so much for being here. Audience members, do not be shy in chat or if you need anything. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, all of you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Allie.
Hello. Thank you, Allie.
And hello to everyone in the chat and to these two wonderful authors who are here with me. We're just going to jump into some general questions that we have planned, but remember you can leave your Q&As in the Q&A box. So I'll kick things off. Would either of you say that anti-colonialism, since we're doing an anti-colonialism SFF panel, is a core theme of your writing and the stories you're drawn to creating?
Yeah, I think that I think as a person of color in this country, in the United States specifically, and I know people are watching from Canada, from other places, I feel like as a recent immigrant to the United States, and I say recent, within the last like 20 years, I don't even know how old I am right now. But as an immigrant to the United States, I feel like I have a lens where I think about not just what colonization means in Latin America and Ecuador, where I'm from, but also my place here in the United States, in a place that was not just colonized, but the turbulent history that made what the United States is. And I feel like I cannot separate that from my writing. And so there's always going to be a theme of identity, the search for home, and all of that to me goes into the idea of anti-colonialism and writing against the idea of colonized spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of my answer is very similar to Zoraida's. And also, I'm just super happy to be here talking with both of you about this is going to be such a great conversation. Yeah, I immigrated to the U.S. When I was 5 from China, and I have very distant memories of what it was like living in China at the time, but I think about China all the time, and especially over the last 10 years or so, seeing the news about Hong Kong, what's happened with Hong Kong, the history of Hong Kong, how it was taken, and how these two countries have basically just been messing with it for 100 years. And seeing what's happening right now with Taiwan, and how Taiwan is basically this pawn between two superpowers. It's been, it's like Zoraida said, it's very hard to separate what's happening in reality and what's happened in our homelands, I guess, from our writing. For me, it's constantly seeped into my work. I majored in political science because I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and I'm just happy that it's good for the world that I did not become a lawyer, but I did find those classes really fascinating because I find politics fascinating. I find these threads between our countries fascinating, and what countries do to each other, what they've had done to each other. I think Sky Hunter is probably my most anti-colonial work because it is literally a story about a young female warrior who is a refugee from a country that's fallen to this empire that has just taken over every single country in the world except for this one tiny last free nation. And she's tasked with being one of these few elite warriors who can defend this country in a losing war against this huge federation. But the country doesn't really, treat her that well. Mara they call her names because she's from a different country. It was inspired originally by the speech that Dr. Khan gave in 2016 about his son, Humayun Khan, who was a Muslim American soldier who was killed in Afghanistan, protecting his fellow soldiers. And I just remember being haunted. Yeah, I remember being haunted by that speech for so long, because I was just like, there's so many young people from all marginalized walks of life that go off and fight for this country and die for this country, and yet come back to a country that doesn't give them the respect that they deserve. And so that went into the creation of Talon as a character, and from there a lot of my memories of China, and just my thoughts about history of countries, coming into other countries, of taking over places, and calling it a good thing. Like all of that went into Sky Hunter. So it's I think maybe it's been more on my mind now than ever before. Yeah. What about you, Melissa?
I definitely pulled from my own experience. How I came up with A Broken Blade was just reading a lot of series in these subgenres, and kind of growing up as a kid, I was used to not seeing First Nations characters in books, or even like Indigenous people from Turtle Island in books at all. And these questions really started bothering me with reading these series of, okay, there's kings, but these weren't your lands before. So whose lands were they? Where did they come from? And it just started striking a lot of familiar questions I remember having as a kid before I understood the history of the land that I'm from. And then I just couldn't really let it go. I was like, okay, well, how do I do this subgenre of fantasy, but tell a story that kind of is more framed towards the Indigenous people of the fantasy world, but still keep that fun, like fast plot and fun found family things that everyone seems to love about the subgenre. And then in other projects, I'm just always writing Indigenous characters, like First Nations characters. And I think there's no way to write a First Nations character without actively thinking about anti-colonialism and the impacts, whatever timeline you're putting them on. So it's always something I'm thinking about. It's also something I do when I'm not being an author. I do language and data sovereignty. So that's actively impacted by colonialism and language loss today. And yeah, like you both said, I just think it's part of my experience. Of course, it's going to frame the way I write and the way I think about the stories that I tell.
I love that. Do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Let's just go through them. Okay.
Yeah.
So the second question is a little similar to the first one. So I think unless like Melissa, you want to reroute, but I think that I'd like to ask how, basically, like, let's talk about how our identities impact the characters that we actually create.
Oh, for sure. I can take that first. I think for me, I knew if I was lucky enough to get my work out there, I knew I wanted to tell stories about Indigenous characters and queer characters and imperfect women. I think those were the gaps that I like craved a lot as a kid and growing up as a teen. I don't think there was a lot of room for publishing back when I was growing up for those kind of stories. I had to seek them out in other places, sometimes in other languages or from storytellers. I'm really glad that this space has seemed to broaden up so much, and there's so much available to people. But I think it's just, for me, I'm always kind of thinking about the people in my life and what that looks like and how would that look in any setting that I put characters into. I don't think it's anything you can really stop as an author, so that would be my answer.
Marie?
Yeah, very similar. I think that especially in creating Talon, I never really set out to consciously put myself into my characters or my main characters, but you know, as I'm writing, it just automatically goes in. You know, it was kind of like what we were saying earlier, it's very difficult and impossible to separate those two things. So you know, like Melissa, I also find myself kind of consciously or unconsciously looking at the people in my life and putting them in some way into the relationships and cast of my books. And with Sky Hunter in particular, you know, I am not Talon, but there are a lot of things about Talon that were taken from my thoughts about, you know, what is a homeland and what is my identity, and also her family. Melissa, you were mentioning like found family, and that's a theme that I go back to over and over as well. In Sky Hunter, Talon escapes from her home country when the Federation invades with her mother, and that's her family. That's it. Like, it's just her and her mom, and they flee to Mara they live on the outskirts of Mara, outside the protective walls, because that's where all the refugees are allowed to live. And they form this found family with both their neighbors as well as Talon's fellow warriors, who are all kind of pieced together from different walks of life. And that very much was a mirror of my first few years in the country, where I didn't speak English, I didn't know anyone. I was very, very shy, and like my family is teeny tiny. Like I was born during the time in China when it was the one-child policy. So I'm an only child. Everyone that I know from that time is an only child. And so my mom had one sister, my dad had one brother, and they each had one kid. So I have like the smallest family in the world. And in the States, like it's just my mom and I, like that's it. So growing up, I had like that very, very tiny core, but a really strong relationship with my mom. And I wanted to put that into the story. So that was my most conscious decision of my identity being put into Talon. So Talon and her mother in the story have a very, very strong connection. There's a lot of descriptions of food in the story between them. And it's how her mother shows her love by leaving her food all the time, cooking for her, telling her that she needs to eat more. Like that's a very Asian thing to do. Like my mom is just like, if I'm at home, it's just like every 2 hours, she's like coming into my room with like plates of fruit or whatever. And I'm like, Mom, you have to stop. I'm gonna explode. She's like, no, you need to eat more. She's like shoveling food on my plate. And that's just her way of showing love. And that appears a lot in the story. So lots of things about mothers and daughters, lots of things about the friends that you pick up along the way in life who become your family.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very similar to what both of you have said. I think that, you know, and maybe some people watching this don't know how long I, like both you, Marie, and myself have been in the industry, and how we've literally watched it change. From our very first published books. When was your legend published?
It was 2011.
2011, and
Yeah,
my debut was 2012. And so I feel like when we talk about identity and how that impacts characters, the very first novel that I went on submission with was in 2008. Okay, and I was 18 years old, and I knew nothing about publishing except that I had an agent, and was as like an intern in publishing. And my novel was about a young Ecuadorian girl, and I recently, because I got really like dramatic and melancholy during my 10-year anniversary, I looked up the rejections from that book, and there were a couple that were like, well, we have a Latino book, and we don't really see the necessity for another one, and so like that as an 18-year-old truly impacted the way that I write characters. So as I started writing, I didn't write for a year because I was sad, and I was like, I'm never going to get published. My life is over. I'm 19 years old. There's no age limit to writing, of course, but 19-year-old Zoraida didn't know that. And so when I started writing my next book, I sort of removed myself from it. And I made the main character was a teenage white boy, and you have to throw a stone for a very long time to find a white boy in Brooklyn at that time. Now, it's everyone's everywhere, but during that period of time, so I wrote this book, and then I made the love interest half Ecuadorian, because I just felt like I needed to strip myself from this book so that I could sell a book. And so once I was in the door, then my work started to change, and then I felt like, okay, now we have this 2 years later, we need diverse books, and we have this push for diversity. And all of a sudden it's like, because all of a sudden it felt like a possibility, because the books that were being written about Native and Asian and Latino and Black kids were predominantly white authors, right? And so, somebody like, I'm not going to mention their name, but like a very famous author can say like, I've been writing diversely my whole life. And it's like, well, because you were given that opportunity, right? Like you literally took that spot, so that somebody can tell another author later, we don't see the necessity to have two. And so because of the change that happened in publishing, then I was like, okay, great. Now it's all Latino all the time. and that's how that identity impacted
Mhm.
my
That's-
stories.
Wow, it's so I guess I don't know if nostalgic is the right word, but like all of your stories are reminding me of how I felt when, you know, my debut came out and how different the landscape was. And I remember looking at the New York Times list back then. It was literally like all white authors. I think I could count on one hand like the number of like diverse authors there were.
Yeah.
And I was the same way. I was very afraid to like write myself into my story. So you're right. That was very much like a conscious decision that was made by a lot of diverse authors, I think, where we have to like hide our identity in order to be successful. And I remember crying about that at some point early on before my book came out. And I was like, do I, you know, erase myself and have a career, or do I write authentically and destroy any chance at being, you know, having a career? And so anyway, yeah, I felt that was very much young Marie as well. But I remember when We Need Diverse books came on the scene and how we could see the shift like year by year by year. So it's amazing to see that change. It's amazing to see more and more diverse books coming out by people who are actually of those marginalizations and backgrounds. So anyway, yeah, hopefully it'll keep going in that direction. Okay, so I think it's my turn to ask a question, right? Okay, so both anti-colonialism and science fiction and fantasy are very broad terms. Are there particular aspects of colonialism that you're interested in exploring or challenging? Specific genres or styles within science fiction and fantasy that lend themselves to that particularly well?
I do have an answer for this one. And for me, I think that something that I actually haven't written is sci-fi, right? Like the way that you write sci-fi, Marie, right? Like, and I think that because I need an entry point, because I think about this all the time, right? Like I write for Star Wars, and in Star Wars, there's like the human race, and then there's like there's a million other races, right? The possibilities are endless. And so there isn't racism in Star Wars the way that there is in our world. And so when you write like a sci-fi novel, and for me, the thing that I would have to grapple with is like, as a person from a colonized land, what does it look like if I'm writing about Latinos in space? Like, are we then going to go colonize alien planets, right? And so like, I know there's a story there somewhere, but if anyone's interested in that, I have an anthology called Reclaim the Stars, and I have authors like Anna Marie McLemore and David Bowles, and they've sort of like written about those topics, but that's something like a specific style that I would like to try, but I really haven't found the entry point yet. But I feel like because you can't write an epic fantasy and not think about colonization. Even George R. R. Martin, like you can see it there, whether or not we like the narrative, right? Like I feel like he's thought about these are these worlds and these and so like I really appreciate world building that tackles that, and because there's not just like one king forever. Like this king had to do something terrible. Empires are not good, right? If we watch Star Wars, we know that the Empire's bad guys. And so like that's a lot of deep thinking of like what happens to people, you know, what happens to people when we make those choices.
That is a lot to think about. Thank you for now I'm like going to go and pick up that anthology and spend my weekend thinking about this question. I think for me, I kind of started writing on the sci-fi and speculative fiction side. Like that's much more my wheelhouse and where my work and like my projects have been before this thought experiment came to be. And I definitely think less on the space side. I'm fascinated by technology. And one of the things that I find really interesting to think about is in if we're thinking about like futurism stories or more like sci-fi dystopian stories where you're on the side of how does colonization impact the technology and how would Indigenous people use it differently. One of the projects I'm working on now is when we get to a capitalist society where even language might be up for grabs and payment, and we might not even be able to protect that. How would Indigenous people go about protecting that? What does the sovereignty of that look like? What are the steps that very much exist in our world today to get there? And then also environmentalism. Like I find a lot of times in sci-fi, it's still very much rooted in like a colonial world or a capitalist world. And I can just think for hours on Indigenous applications of like high tech, but still very much combined with living off the land and sustainability. So if I do get to write a project in that space, that'll be very much where I end up going. I also like playing with personhood and tense, I think, because I'm such an oral storyteller. That's where my graduate degree was in. So I'd love to try and find a way to bring that into a book and talk about those elements. But yeah, these are the things that I think about all the time. Who knows if it'll turn into a book people get to read, though. We shall see.
We'll see.
What about you, Marie?
Oh, that's fascinating. I love what you mentioned about technology because that was something that I thought of. I'm also fascinated by technology. I am constantly, both like fascinated and curious and unsettled by how quickly things can change in technology. One of my older series, Warcross, was an exploration of near future sci-fi. So Warcross is set like a few years in our future and about how a virtual reality and augmented reality game kind of just takes.
It is so good.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, it was weird researching for that series because usually, I'm kind of used to taking my time with research and like reading like stacks of like books about like the Renaissance or whatever. But this one was like I had to read like every Wired magazine every month and see, what was going on and like read like whatever Tech Weekly digest to see like make sure that I'm not like writing old news into my book. And it's fascinating to see it because I think that technology is a form of control, and especially in this day and age, it's a way of taking over a people and taking over our minds, taking over the way that we think, what our preferences are. You can see like what's happening with Web 2.0 and how it it's like this is a cyclical feed where you are shown what you want to see, which then it twists your mind into thinking that that's reality, and then that just gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. And I think that the control that tech has over the way that we see the world, the way that we see others, the way that it can take over other countries in this new age can be a very unsettling new age of the next frontier. And so yeah, I'm haunted by that. And I think that I am always curious to read more books about technology and how that can change what's happening in science fiction and what's happening in our world in terms of like how it changes the story of control and how we control others. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's my turn to ask the next question. So what thematic opportunities does science fiction fantasy offer that other genres may not? What are some of the limitations or challenges of writing SFF novels versus other genres? Zoraida, do you want to start off since you do fantasy and romance?
Yes. Wait, hold on. I'm looking. Which question number was this?
Number 5.
5. Okay. I'm looking at it. I think science fiction and fantasy lets us look at our world at a distance, right? It is it's not an allegory. I mean, it's an allegory, but it's not our world. And so I think that it gives us the permission to say, okay, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to enjoy. If I just want a story about a girl fighting her way into saving the love of her life, that's cool. But if somebody is looking for something else, they can also see the layers of, oh, this girl was kidnapped by her enemy people and used as a weapon against her own kind. And as happens in my book Incendiary. And so like it feels like if you're looking for it, it's there, but if you also just want something fun, it's also there. So it gives us like both. And then with romance, I feel like, well, romance to me is a subset of science fiction fantasy, because if a romance hero is not some sort of cryptid, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, I think like you said, I think that sci-fi fantasy is a way for us to look at the world at a distance. And I always think of sci-fi fantasy as like stepping into a carnival funhouse mirror building, you know, of the world, where you get to warp reality and say like, oh, I want to see there's this one thing, a very specific thing about our reality that bothers me or that haunts me. Let me take that and I can blow it up. I can exaggerate it. I can twist it around. I can shine like a weird light on it. I can, you know, carnival funhouse it to make a point. And it's a genre where you can exaggerate without it seeming like utterly ridiculous. Or you can make it utterly ridiculous in that, you know, in a satirical way, and that works as well. I think it's a really almost cathartic way of, for me, processing some of the things that disturb me about the real world. And in terms of limitations, I do think that, you know, it's both like the best and worst thing about writing sci-fi and fantasy, where you get to have control over this entire fantastical world. I love just kind of playing God in like my own sandbox, where I'm just like, I can do anything. I am God in this world. I can make mountains. I can like change the weather. But then at the same time, the limitation is like, oh God, you are God. Like you have a lot of responsibilities. Like I can't even keep my plants alive. So, you know, if you do like one wrong thing in the world building, it's like all your people. I'm like, okay. I think there's a lot of marbles in the air that you'd kind of have to make sure everything makes sense and works, and that the theme that you're trying to carry across is actually getting carried across. And I find that really challenging, but also it's part of the fun of sci-fi and fantasy to tackle that challenge. Melissa?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have other books out yet, so I can't speak to published works, but the stuff that I've written on, I definitely find at a distance, like Zoraida said, is a very good way to describe it when I'm writing fantasy. I like that kind of barrier there. It also makes me feel a little bit more safe when I'm giving a critique in terms of how people might perceive it, or more importantly, my character in making that decision, because I don't agree with a lot of the stuff my main character does. I have a hard time writing her sometimes. But in terms of limitations, I think on the fantasy side, for me, it's more understanding how to write outside of a broken blade, but understanding that idea. And I think it's more a limitation on myself and growing as a writer of how to transport the cultural context where I'm coming from, because I know a lot of people haven't grown up with First Nations stories and First Nations literature, and can't like even simply pronounce simple vocabulary in our language. How do you go about communicating a whole worldview in the way that I want to in future works? And I'm interested to see if fantasy is a place where I can do that in a way that resonates with readers. I hope so, but we'll see.
Yeah, I always find it curious when people are like, they can say Daenerys Targaryen, but then they're like, oh, look, a word in Spanish. I don't know how to read anymore.
Yeah. And like, I love that you both like shared your experience on how it was to be a writer and seeing those changes happen. But we were talking about Cemetery Boys. I just read that a few months ago, and it was one of the like first times I had actually reflected on, when's the last time I had read YA fiction where, now mind you, I haven't been reading a lot of YA fiction, where other languages are just kind of put into the work and allowed to exist. And I was reflecting a lot on, that was not something that I was able to kind of access at like 12 years old, where, that would have been an anomaly, I think, in the fiction that was doing really well at the time and were being pushed on teens all the time. I'm really excited to see that other languages are allowed to exist and are given their full sovereign status in works and appreciated the way they should be.
I feel like we're blowing through time, and we have so many good questions. I would love to ask you guys, what are some common tropes in science fiction fantasy that you'd like to see less of, and why, or more of, actually? Like, we could do less or more.
Okay.
Yeah. Melissa?
I think I'm over white savior tropes in fantasy. I'm over reading them, but I also sometimes have a hard time sitting with them after. I think they affect me a lot, just as someone who deals with a lot of like language activism and land back and stuff in my day-to-day life. I can see sometimes how those stories have really impacted the way people I'm communicating with think. So I would like to see less of that and more of people maybe critiquing that in their work. And I think that comes with just like publishing more diverse voices, and hopefully that can create a cultural impact that I think would make it much easier for any marginalized communities when they're advocating for what they need and what's important to them. So I think that's one for less. For more, I think I said it. I don't know if it's I would say a trope, but I would just like to see more diverse writing across the board. That will always be my answer, I think.
Oh my gosh, you mentioned like less white saber tropes, in my mind just went through like every single white saber trope that's been around for the last like even 5 years. I'm like, oh, too many. It hurts my head. Yeah, less of that, please. Yeah, that one in particular drives me insane. For more, I think there's a lot of tropes that I haven't seen enough of written diversely. Like I think that people think that there's some tropes that have been done to death, or like vampires, vampires, mermaids, these things, but these are all, so many of them were written, before we were allowed to write in these tropes, before like 2011. And so I feel like a lot of people might say, oh, I'm over love triangles, or oh, I'm over this or that. And I'm like, but wait, like give us a chance to like play in those realms, because these tropes exist for a reason. They're fun, and they're fun to read. We love them for a reason, and a lot of us haven't been allowed to write stories with those tropes in them, right? So
you're absolutely right.
So I love that so many of your stories have that, right? I like they make me so happy. Like you are able to like create these beautiful, awesome stories, like giving fresh life to all of these tropes that people think they're familiar with. I think that we all secretly love all of these tropes, whether we, admit it or not.
I would 1000% agree with that. I think that people just get bogged down with the idea that you have to invent something brand new. And I feel like there's one of the first lessons that I was taught when I went to a writing camp when I was 16 at the National Book Foundation. And one of the teachers was like, there's nothing new under the sun. And she used to quote, and I forgot the author that she quoted, but she would say, good authors borrow, great authors steal. And meaning like not obviously plagiarism, but sort of like stealing from the world around you. And sometimes that just means like, yeah, Romeo and Juliet is not the first star-crossed lovers, right? Shakespeare was pulling that from Greek mythology. And so instead of trying to be like, the idea that you're going to create a brand new thing that never existed is sort of like a fool's errand, because we exist in the world and we collect everything. So like we're siphoning stories, we're siphoning the news, we're siphoning like the things our parents tell us, or the things our friends tell us. And so like all of that creates something new, because only Melissa could have written this story the way that it was written. Like I could never take that premise and write it the exact same way, right? Like I couldn't have written Warcross the same way that you wrote it. And so it's sort of like, yeah, I would love to give an entire, that's what I love about anthologies, right? Sometimes you can like say like, okay, here's this one trope, everybody go write a love triangle short stories, and because it'll always be different, and it's about the way you tell things. So I would like to see less of a focus on like on white saviorism, but I also want to see more, kinds of strength for women characters and young girls, because I feel like we've gotten into this habit of like, oh, strong girl knife. But there are other ways to be strong in whatever way we present. And I feel like that's also really important. Of course, I love badass girls who like, you know, who wield weapons, but I think that like showing them as like multi-dimensional characters, like both of you do, right? Like that's something that I want to see more of as well.
Yes, totally yes to that. Yeah, and I think that like maybe strong female characters was maybe always like a misguided term, where it should have been, you know, like should have just been like complex female characters.
Yeah, complex,
or real like, female characters. You know, yeah, I think Melissa, you were saying about like creating characters who feel real and flawed. Like girls should be allowed to be flawed.
Exactly.
Like, can we make mistakes? Like, can we do something stupid for once when we're young and, you know, make mistakes? And can we not be like the one who, you know, takes the high ground or whatever? So it's, yeah, I agree with that. I think that
or hypocrites. I found growing up that if the girls in books were never allowed to be hypocritical of themselves. There were a lot of hypocritical decisions happening for boy characters and male characters.
I feel like we're always just harder on young women. We just are as a collective society, and I hope that we can grow a little bit more faster.
Yes, absolutely. I have no idea how much time we have, so
I think Allie's gonna, there she is.
Oh, okay.
So we're at about the 45-minute mark. So we're going to take a few audience questions.
Right.
Audience members, if you have more questions, please throw them in the Q&A. We always love to hear from you. So now is the time. Let's start with, this is an interesting question from Carolyn. Have the stories and experiences of your characters had an impact on your own personal perspectives and actions in life?
It's a really interesting question.
Does anybody want to start?
My character, I don't know. I want to say no, because I write very violent people sometimes. So I would hope that the answer is probably no. But I think that when I write a character where I'm trying to be like, okay, this character is like super empathetic, I would like, it makes me think for a long time. For instance, like my next book is my Star Wars book, and there's a character who's a Jedi, and I kept writing her flawed, and they were like, well, she's a Jedi, she usually like, you know, like we have to contextualize her anger and her fear and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, it's really hard writing about somebody who's supposed to be perfect. So that like made me think about what I think about perfection and what I think about my place in like in being a good person. So I guess probably.
Do you want to tackle it? Nancy?
Any other burning answers?
I would
Melissa?
say, I don't think it's anything that Keera did in the book. I find myself a lot more like another character that's revealed in the middle of the book than I do my main character. But I think having to write her and sit with her decisions was always a practice in empathy, but also like as a writer, I had to tackle a lot of my perfectionism and my like that thing that's ingrained in us as women to constantly be giving as much as you can, and that self-sacrificial kind of instinct that, at least for me, I had to grapple with a lot, because I think I would have handled things very differently than my character. So I think in that way, Keera made me kind of sit and think about what the other options were available, and that they're perfectly valid and also could be seen as moral decisions. And then there is another character in the Halfling saga that definitely has definitely impacted my ideas, but they don't come around until the next book. So I can't really speak to that.
Surprise.
I love that. That was tantalizing. Yeah, I think that, well, I've definitely had characters where I'm writing them halfway through, and also some of my characters are very violent as well. Just like Zoraida, where I'm like, I remember writing Adelina for the Young Elites, and
Oh yeah.
the Young Elites is like a story about a girl who becomes a villain. And halfway through that series, I'm just like, I gotta get out of this headspace. And so I go hug my dogs, because she's just always like, destroy, revenge. And my husband's like, are you okay? I'm like, I'm fine. Yeah, so I had to kind of detox myself from Adelina, was writing her. I do think that,
No, go ahead.
no. Like, I do think I've like kind of come out of writing some of my characters with new information or knowledge about things or interest in things that I didn't have before. Like, I remember like looking up DJ classes after writing Warcross, because one of the characters was a DJ. And in Legend, writing June as a character, June is like a character who's very she's like Sherlockian in the way that she thinks about things and counts things. And so I remember writing her as a character, and she was just like a pain in the ass to write, because she would just be like, oh, you know, paper clips, they're made out of titanium alloy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, so she looks like she's effortlessly writing this stuff off. And I have to, when I'm writing, I'm like, crap, I have to go stop and then go to Wikipedia and look up like the history of paper clips and, you know, learn all this random stuff. So I found myself after writing Legend just kind of like counting things, because June constantly just counts stuff. She counts like the tiles, she counts the time, she counts the seconds. And I started doing that, and I hate math. So I was just like, I have got to stop writing characters who count things, because my poor copy editor is just always sending me these like long documents where she's like, none of these numbers add up. And I have to like go back and figure it out. So anyway, yeah, I feel like I like take on some of the characteristics of my characters for like a brief period of time, you know, after writing them. Then I kind of go back to my own self.
So I have a sort of related question from Priscilla that says, what character have you missed the most after finishing their story? Let's start with Zoraida.
Yeah, let me see if I can't topple this book stack. I would probably say, honestly, I was actually thinking about this today. And I was like, I miss the characters from my series Incendiary, the Hollow Crown series. And because this is the second book, Illusionary, came out. And so I actually earlier today read the epilogue that I wrote and was like tearing up, because I was like, oh my God, they're still happy in this, you know, like it ends well. So I would say Renata and Castian, the main characters of that series. I miss all of my characters at some point when I think about like I'll either see an actress or like somebody on the street who like looks like them or something, but things will remind me all the time, for sure.
Love that.
Yeah, I think, well, for Legend, I clearly missed writing about Day in June, because after book 3, because then I wrote a book 4 like 7 years later, where I was like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I have to get this out of my head. So so I really did miss Day in June a lot when I finished Champion. I really miss writing about Anika from Warcross. I think she was my most wish fulfillment main character that I had, and the one who was probably the closest to me in terms of maybe not personality, but just like things that I wish I had. So I loved writing about her, and I kind of miss her. She was really fun. Yeah.
What about you, Melissa? I know.
Well, I'm very much in the editing process of this movie. And I can't say there is a character that was very hard to let go of, but that's a major spoiler.
Oh no.
But
Oh my God.
I definitely have someone in mind. I just can't say who it is.
Okay. No spoilies.
That was an agonizing answer. I loved it. Okay. So here's a really fun question from Rachel. Did any of you have an original alternate ending to any of your books?
Yes, lots. I think almost every single one of my books had an original alternate ending before, and they were almost always too dark. and then I would have to pull it back. Like the original ending for Legend was way sadder than it actually turned out to be, and I wrote it and I was like, this is way too sad. I can change it. Same with The Young Elites, same with, actually no, Warcross I think turned out about the same. Yeah, those first 2 series were brutal, and Sky Hunter also was sad. I almost always have to pull myself. I'm like think happier thoughts for the ending.
That's too funny. I mean, the comments are saying, OMG, you're making me nervous.
Yeah, look, get nervous. We have no idea where this is going. The first book in my Brooklyn, okay, I write knowing my first sentence and my last scene. I walk into a book knowing both of those things because I know where I'm starting and I know what I'm trying to write toward, right? And the only book where it has changed is the first book in the Brooklyn Brujas series, Labyrinth Lost, because I was going through something and I was literally, all of those characters were supposed to die at the very end. Like, you know, our bud, Adam Silvera, they all died at the end. And it didn't happen that way. By the time we got to revisions, you know, it was like, I was like, all right, I changed my mind. But that's the only time.
I appreciate that. All right. What about you, Melissa?
You can't give it away.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I can't say for the series. I can say though that I didn't know where exactly A Broken Blade was going to be ending, because I wrote what I guess could be considered a prequel and A Broken Blade and a little bit beyond all at once in the first draft. Because I was still trying to find the story. And then so when I was writing, I thought I had a slightly different end in mind. And then I kind of cut off a lot from the beginning, a whole like 30-year chunk, and then a little bit from the end, and that became A Broken Blade.
Well, interesting. So let's see here. This is a great question from an anonymous attendee that says, do you have advice that you would give your young writer self? Does anyone want to start? Okay, I'm picking
Call
on
on
you.
us.
I'm gonna be your mean teacher.
Okay.
Marie, go for it.
Okay. Well, when I was an aspiring writer in my teens, I had a bad habit of like writing 3 chapters and then stopping, and because it wasn't coming out the way that it looked in my head, it always looked perfect. And in my head, I would write it, I'm like, what the hell is that? And then I would try to make it perfect, but it wouldn't. And then I would turn my wheels in the mud, and then some other shiny idea would come along and I would drop that one and write like another 3 chapters, and I would just keep doing this. And I had like 50 of them. I never got anywhere. And then NaNoWriMo was the thing that I finally ended up doing, which forced me to finish, a story. And it just taught me, like, first draft, quantity over quality. Just whatever it is, just get it out on the page. It doesn't matter how bad it is. My first drafts are still awful. It's fine. I don't think I know anyone. Actually, I know one person who writes great first drafts. And very jealous. But I would go back and tell myself, before I did those, wasting my time doing those 50, non-finished stories, to just like give yourself permission to write something bad. Like, it's okay, because you can always go back and make it better, but you cannot make something better if it doesn't exist. And it's much better to have something finished and bad than to have something that is completely unfinished. And you're never going to get that out of your head perfectly the first time. And that's something that I have to come to terms with every single time I write a book, even now. And this is why I hate everything when I'm writing my first drafts. It's my least favorite part of the process because of that. But I have learned to force myself to just keep going. I'm like, you know what? What you see on the page is not the final thing. It's fine. You can make it better, So that's always my biggest piece of advice to myself.
Mine would be to be patient. When I was, as I said, as you heard me say that when I was 18 and I got rejected, I was like, I'll never write again. I think that, that was like part of me not understanding that there's no time limit, and that it's better to gain sort of real world knowledge before jumping in, and that there's no time limit, and just take it easy. This industry is not going anywhere.
Yeah, I would tell young me to show your work to people. I had this thing where I was convinced my whatever I was working on had to be absolutely perfect before I would show it to anyone. And I did that with A Broken Blade too. No one in my family knew that I was self-publishing a book before the books came in. And I think that's caused a lot of issues for me. One, because it's really hard to develop a community of writers and people you like if you're not showing work to people and engaging in that. And two, it's a lot easier to work on edits. And I found that I actually love the editing experience with all the different projects that I've been editing lately. But it's a lot easier for me to hand over something that I know needs a little bit of work and I want feedback on, and I can kind of like work collaboratively with someone, than something that I've worked on way too long and convinced it's exactly what I want it to be, and then I don't want to necessarily hear feedback on. So that was definitely my issue for a long time, and thankfully I found I love editing. It's my favorite part. So I just hand things over now as soon as I feel like I can.
That. Okay, so we are about at our time. So I'm going to ask one last question. And it's, what is the next thing? What should we keep an eye out for? And let's start with you, Melissa.
Sure. So book 2 is coming. I can't say when exactly it's coming, but I can say that if you're in the TikTok space, some fun stuff is going to be happening at the end of the month to reveal book 2 and when it'll be released, what it's going to be called, and possibly even a cover. And then, yeah, if you're ever wanting to know what's up with me on other projects and things like that, my TikTok is usually the best place to find me.
And I just linked it. So
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, so exciting. Yeah, like Rachel said, so exciting. What about you, Marie?
So my next YA is coming out next spring. It's called Stars and Smoke. It's a story about a boy named Winter Young, who is a music superstar. He's like the hottest thing in the world. And And he gets recruited to be a spy by a covert organization that needs his help to take down a criminal tycoon. So he gets recruited to become a spy and gets paired with a secret agent named Sydney, who cannot stand him. And the two of them have to figure out how to work together. It's very much enemies to lovers. You know, we're talking about our favorite tropes. So that's one of mine. Enemies to lovers, as this, pop star and his secret agent have to work together to solve this like Mission Impossible mission. So it's very much like The Bodyguard meets Mission Impossible. And this was my like quarantine story that I wrote. I started this story, like I conceived it in like the first couple of months of the pandemic, when I was just like, everything is awful, I can't read the news right now, I just need to write something that truly is just escapism for me. And so this was the story that came out of it.
Okay, amazing. That sounds incredible. I linked the pre-order.
Thank you.
And then, what about you? Oh wait. We may have I think you're muted.
I don't know how I did that. I don't know.
It happens. It
I didn't touch
happens.
anything. Oh yeah. I have the paperback of my novel, The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina, just came out last month. That is a magical realism adult novel, multi-generational family, where a grandmother hands over an inheritance to three cousins, and they discover it's magic and they don't know where it comes from, but it is very, very deadly. People in their family have begun to die. They don't understand it, and so they have to go back to Ecuador, where their grandmother was from, in order to figure out what happened and what is this power that came. I also have a middle grade, my second middle grade, which was my quarantine novel that I wrote in 2020, and it's called Valentina Salazar is Not a Monster Hunter. And that's my homage to Supernatural, except it's like kids driving around in a van protecting monsters instead of killing them.
As they should be.
Yeah. And then my next adult book, which I'm writing now, is a tragic love story between a fallen angel and a human lady.
Ooh, that's
my
so
God.
exciting.
That sounds amazing.
We'll see.
It's all eyeballs in the chat right now. So.
Yeah. Go to Goodreads. I'm sure somebody put it up on Goodreads at some already to pre-save.
Yes, we've got a lot of excitement happening in chat, so we love to see that. All right, so it is definitely time to call it a night, but I'm just going to take this one last moment to say a huge thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. For anyone who would like to get hands on copies of A Broken Blade, I'm going to go ahead and relink in the chat, so definitely come on in. Pick that up. We would love to see you. Let us know what you thought of this event in person or on any of our social media. Melissa, Marie, and Zoraida, I'm so happy you were here. This was so much fun. This was such
Thank
a
you,
thoughtful and interesting event, and I so appreciate it. Do you have any last words you would like to share?
I just want to say congratulations, Melissa. Like, you've done something really amazing, and we just want to congratulate you.
So happy for you. There's nothing but exciting things up ahead.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Miigwech, for joining me today. This was so cool. And yeah, I had a great time.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Let's do the waving thing. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.